upheld Roe. She's the co-author of the book Controlling Women: What We Must Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom. Also with us is Michelle Goodwin, Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, host of the Ms. Magazine podcast On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin, and author of Policing the Womb: Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. She just has a piece out in the New York Times, headline, "No Justice, Alito. Reproductive justice is in the Constitution." We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Professor Goodwin, let's begin with you. Can you talk about your response to the Supreme Court overturning Roe after almost 50 years?
Well, it's good to be back with you, Amy, on the show. The decision itself, just as we saw with the leaked draft, has many errors, omissions. It has a selective, if not opportunistic, reading of American history. It does not center in all of its claimed originalism and all of its claimed textualism. Interestingly enough, it avoids the 13th Amendment. It even avoids the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. And here's what my New York Times piece was about. It was that when Congress abolished, through the ratification of the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, they were not abolishing that just for Black men. They very well understood that involuntary servitude for Black women in the United States meant involuntary sexual assaults, rapes, and then the reproduction after that, as Black women were forced to labor, not only in the fields, but also labor under the weight, a different kind of shackling of slavery, which was sexual subordination and reproduction. This was very well known. The abolitionist in Congress who led the way for the 13th Amendment spoke and wrote about this. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death in the halls of Congress 2 days after giving a speech about the raping of Black women. Sojourner Truth spoke to it. I mean, it was clear, the New York Times, there were articles about it. So the very idea that there was no one thinking about involuntary servitude as being consistent with involuntary reproduction is just absurdist. It was written about everywhere. Everyone knew this as being one of the devastating effects of American slavery, and it was abolished with the 13th Amendment. And then later on with the 14th Amendment, it was still recognized that Black women were psychologically, physically, and reproductively still being harmed in southern states. Their children were being denied citizenship. Their children were being snatched and taken away from them. And the 14th Amendment was therefore then ratified. The piece goes into depth in all of these categories to give an education to the Supreme Court and to our country to remember this, because otherwise Black women have been essentially erased from the Constitution. And by erasing Black women from the Constitution, we ultimately erase all women from the Constitution, because the 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment not only freed Black women from these bondages, but it also freed white women from these bondages. None of this is given any kind of reading by the originalist and textualist on the Supreme Court, who seem to ignore all of that and have now rendered us to a country where there are free states, where individuals can be free in their bodies, and also those where it is non-free. And one can't help but understand this as being so consistent with the patterns of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States.
And let's talk about the trajectory right